To me, we've recently joined forces with the Institute of Renewable Natural Resource and Texas Water Resources Institute at Texas A&M. So we're working closely together, and I've gotten to know more about the Institute of Renewable Natural Resources and see the things that they do and some of the tools that they have. There's several things that have really stood out to me, and this Texas land trends data is one of the neatest things I've seen, and we're hoping to do some things with water trends in the same manner. But without further ado, Todd.
Thank you all. Like Kevin was saying, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to talk to y'all today about Texas land trends and Texas water trends and some of the tools we developed and that we can deliver through the internet to give you a good snapshot of what's going on in Texas with how people are using the land use conversion, where it's taking place, and try and link that back to what that public benefit of our rural working lands are, and link that to the benefits to water quality, water quantity, and the values that those rural working lands provide. Actually, this is a snapshot of Texas in 1992, the nighttime illumination of Texas. So if you look at okay. There we go. This is Texas in 1992. Looking at it from space. This is nighttime illumination. If you look real closely to 2000, this next one's going to be 2010. You'll notice all those blobs that are our major urban areas grew significantly, especially there along the I-35 corridor, I-45 corridor, and Interstate 10, there along the triangle there in the eastern two-thirds of Texas. This last shot here is the difference between in that 20-year period. So you can see that just from looking at Texas at night from space, there's been a tremendous amount of growth around our urban areas, along the I-35 corridor, down in the valley, portions of West Texas. One thing that we found real interesting, if you look out there in West Texas, there west of Midland, Odessa, you'll see a nice big blob there, and that's associated with all the oil and gas development that's going on there in the last decade. But the take-home message is over the last 20 years, Texas has really undergone a transformation, especially along the eastern two-thirds of the state, when it comes to converting from a primarily rural state to one of more of an urban area, a more urbanized state. So from 2000 to 2010, we saw a 20.6% increase in population growth. 4.3 million people moved to Texas, where our population is right now around 25 million. Forecast for 2020 push that to nearly 30 million people here in the next 8 to 10 years. By 2060, they forecast that could be up to 46.3 million, almost double where we're at now. So you can imagine, what Texas looks like now at night, and where you've got all these urban centers and these concentrations of where people live. What that'll look like 20 years from now, or I guess 30, 40 years from now, if our population doubles again, and the pressures that'll put on land in Texas and all the resources we have here in Texas, and then ultimately what impact that's going to have on water quality, water quantity, and those other goods and services that these rural lands provide. Texas, by far, is the fastest growing state in the U.S. You can attribute that to our great climate. People just love hot, humid weather. Or you can look at it as the good economic times in Texas compared to the rest of the U.S. But by far, it leads the nation in growth compared to all the other states. And this trend of loss of rural working lands isn't just something we see here in Texas. You see these same trends going on in other areas, other states like Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, that have been traditionally rural, agricultural-based states, where you're seeing this huge turnover of land from these rural agricultural lands to other developed uses. If you look at the population growth, population in 2007, on these maps The areas depicted in green shades are going to be your lower population areas, and as you go up the color ramp there to the oranges and yellows, those are your higher population areas. So you can see that, no surprise, the eastern two-thirds of the state of Texas, especially along the interstate corridors, is our highest population areas. Well, those areas are also where we saw our highest growth. And you'll notice, let's see if this has like here in Dallas, this is Dallas County here, this is Harris County here. You didn't see a huge change in those traditionally urban counties. Where you saw the biggest change is in these outlying counties. There around Dallas and Fort Worth, where you've seen this explosion of growth in these outlying areas, and going out into those, 20, 30 years ago were rural communities. In that 10-year period from 97 to 2007, 85% of the population growth was confined to 25 high-growth counties throughout the state. So the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Houston Metroplex, I-35 corridor, portions of the Valley, and then El Paso. If we look at our loss of our agricultural lands in that same period, 2.1 million acres of rural working lands, farms, ranches, and forests were converted in that 10-year period. 40% of that conversion was in those top 25 high-growth counties. So tremendous pressures on those lands there in those high-growth areas. In this map, the red indicates our highest conversion rate. So you see where we're seeing our highest loss of these rural working lands. The trend holds true. It's still in those 25 high-growth counties there in our along the interstate corridors. So if you just do a little back of the envelope cowboy math, if we look at just simple land consumption rates, we need 149 acres for every 1,000 new residents that come to the state. So every time 1,000 people move to Texas, roughly 149 acres of what was open space lands, agricultural lands, farms, ranches, and forests are converted to some other use. If we extrapolate that out, down the road to 2020, we'll lose another 1.4 million acres in the next 10 years if we continue that rate of growth. And one of the other pressures on these rural working lands is the rural land values. As you can imagine, as we've seen tremendous demand for land as Texas has grown, rural land values have skyrocketed. In 2007, if you look at these maps here, the green are going to be your lowest values for land. Going up to the reds will be our highest values. Highest land values, trend holds true. The interstate corridors, Edwards Plateau, portions of the valley are our highest land value areas. Well, those land values have also seen a huge change over the last decade. As demand has increased, those land values are skyrocketing. So that's another driver of rural land conversion. As that land value gets extremely high, many farmers, ranchers, foresters look at it and go, farming's a hard scratch life. Let's look at selling it off for $20,000 an acre and taking that money and buying a house down in Port O'Connor and fish for the rest of your life. So, you see this trend throughout through the state. Like I said, this is confined to those 25. Going back to that map we saw earlier, those 25 high growth counties that we see there in Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, I-35 corridor. If you look at it from stepping back at the entire state and looking at it by different regions, look at the percent change there on the left hand on the y-axis going across. Looking at the different regions, the Edwards Plateau by far has seen the highest rate of increase in land values over any region throughout the state. Anybody who's been in Texas knows that the Edwards Plateau is quite possibly one of the prettiest places in the state. A lot of water, a lot of recreational opportunities, hunting opportunities, real good place to live. So people are wanting to move out there, and it's driving a lot of demand for that land. So you see those areas like the Edwards Plateau and the Llano Uplift having that biggest percent change. Whereas areas that are still more rural, fewer pressures from urban development like the High Plains, the Trans-Pecos, parts of the Piney Woods, you're not seeing as high of a rate of or percent change in those rural land values. And we'll start looking at why are we wondering about rural land values. That's one pressure on land and one of the drivers of conversion. One of the other things we also look at is the economic profitability of the land. And our farmers and ranchers, our foresters, these different rural landowners actually making money off of their land, because one of the single biggest predictors of land use conversion is loss of economic profitability. So pulling from some of the ag census data that USDA does every few years, we looked at ownership size, and then there on the bottom you're going from there on the left from small to large. Your small acreages less than 10 acres to your large ones that are greater. Your large operations greater than 2,000 acres. If you look at the 10-acre and smaller landowners, fewer than 20% of those reported back that they were actually making money off of their property. Whereas you go out to the larger landowners, greater than 60% of them are actually reporting back that they're making a profit. So we start looking at one of the big drivers of land use conversion is loss of economic profitability. So we start looking at these smaller ownerships and say, man, they're having a harder time, making a living. So those are going to be the targets for, additional or future land use conversion. Actually look at the dollars per acre per year reported back to the ag census. And so not only are these small ownership sizes, these small operations, not only not reporting any kind of net proceeds, they're also reporting significant losses on any given year on a dollar per acre basis. So there's significant pressure on those smaller acreages there throughout the state to convert to some other use other than these rural working lands. So we start looking at all these pressures that are putting on the land, either for the demand for the land, loss of economic profitability of the land, and what we're seeing is these large ownerships overall throughout the state are getting broken up. Now I know you see on this graph we see a trend where greater than 5,000 acre farms and ranches, we're actually seeing more of those over the last 10 years. And the same in the 2,000, 5,000, but those are really confined to two areas in the state. South Texas, where you're seeing large operations combining, looking at consolidating their land holdings, and that's really driven, by the, hunting industry. You're seeing it skyrocketing. People are really making a lot of money off of hunting, so they're looking at consolidating their holdings there. The other place that you're seeing that is also in the High Plains. In the High Plains, agriculture is still a good business, so you're seeing some of these large landowners consolidating their land holdings up there. But throughout the rest of the state, seeing tremendous pressure on our larger land ownerships to break up, get smaller. What's the average landowner in the state of Texas? I believe it's 58 years old. So most of the landowners are older. You're seeing large farms and ranches being split between heirs or selling up parts of it to help pay the bills. So you're seeing a lot of pressure in these smaller land ownerships being fragmented, getting smaller and smaller every year, which makes, when we come from a management standpoint, it becomes more and more difficult to manage as these tracts get smaller. So look at, what type of land is being lost throughout the state. Just broad categories. In that 10-year period from 97 to 2007, dry cropland we lost was at 20.3 million acres. We lost 7.5% of that. Native rangeland was at 92.6 million acres. We lost about 2% of that. Some of that loss was attributed to an increase in non-native pasture. People converting our native rangelands to some other non-native pasture, improved grazing lands. Forest areas, we actually saw an increase in forested areas. Irrigated cropland went up slightly. And then you see this, the reason I point this out, this huge increase in what's designated as wildlife management. And the reason for that, you see this huge increase, is that in this data, all this data is coming out of appraisal district records that are property tax records. And in 1997, nobody was enrolled in wildlife management as a 1D1 open space classification. But in that time period, you saw, that came on the rolls. People started getting more involved in wildlife management. So you saw more and more people start actually enrolling their land and managing their land specifically for wildlife management. what does this mean? 2.1 million acres of rural working lands were converted to non-open space uses. The reason that's important is we look at that is these are our water catchments. These are our water producing lands. These are the lands that contribute to water quality and water quantity. So, as we've got all these pressures on these rural working lands, and, there's additional public benefit beyond the traditional commodities that they provide, beyond the food and fiber that they provide. We've got water quality, water quantity issues. So we've got these tremendous pressures on these lands that's from development, and the links that we need to start making to, looking at these trends on what impact is that going to have to our future water supplies. As we all know, we've been in a tremendous drought for the last 2 years. This is a snapshot of the Us Drought Monitor from about 2 years ago, last December of 2009, just over 2 years ago. The vast majority of the state was not in drought conditions except for a couple of small areas there in South Texas that seem to be in perpetual drought, but the vast majority of the state was in non-drought conditions. A year later, you start seeing the onset of the drought. We were about 12 months into a moderate drought in 2010. October 4th, 2011 was the height of the drought in Texas. Over 95% of the state was in exceptional drought conditions. So all that maroon area, the vast majority of the state was in extreme drought conditions. We've since seen a little moderation over the last few months to the point where now only about a quarter of the state is in exceptional or exceptional drought conditions, but still the entire state is in some condition of drought. That brings me to the 2012 water plan. Look at some of the water trends, linking back, how these land trends are going to affect some of our water trends. Texas State Water Plan was adopted in December 2011, sent to the governor on January 5th, 2012. This is the 9th water plan since the inception of the Texas Water Development Board in 1957, which was put together after the drought of the 50s. The take-home message of the water plan was that in serious drought conditions, Texas does not and will not have enough water to meet the needs of its people, businesses, and agricultural enterprises. Is everybody real familiar with the water plan here? Anybody taking a quick look at what all's in there? If you haven't, one of the take-home messages is this is a diagram, a schematic of the 2010 existing supplies. So right now this is looking at, during a drought of record, how much water does the state have to meet its demand? So this is in a drought, in drought conditions. What do we have? In a wet year, we've got plenty of water. But in a drought year, these are looking at the most extreme conditions. In a drought year, we've got about 17 million acre feet of water available to municipal, manufacturing, mining, steam electric generation, livestock, and irrigation uses throughout the state. About 8 million of that comes from surface water. Another 8 million comes from groundwater, and about 500,000 comes from water reuse technologies. So you look at the demand. We've got about 17 million acre feet of existing supplies. During a drought of record, we got about 18 million demand. So we got about a million acre feet shortfall even now. The water plan projects demand out 50 years. So looking at a 2060 scenario, the state of Texas population demand the population has doubled. Obviously, demand for water is going to increase. In 2060, if we look at just existing supplies, water we have on hand right now, we're looking at 15.2 million acre feet of water available, of which 8.9 million comes from surface water, 5.7 million comes from groundwater, and they're figuring by then we'll have 600,000 acre feet available from water reuse technology. The demand is split out here. The same categories: municipal, manufacturing, mining, steam electric, livestock, and irrigation, with by far the two largest demands being municipal and agricultural irrigation. Our projected demand is 21.95 million. So a very significant shortfall. Looking at these dashed lines, those dashed lines represent what we have now. So we recognize that what we have now is, in 2060, some of that won't be there. Municipal demand is going to be going up. Manufacturing demand will increase. Expecting mining to remain basically the same. And irrigation from agricultural uses to actually go down. So we see a significant shortfall. This represents our shortfall in water supplies coming out. So our projected shortfall is about 6.6 million acre feet of water in a drought of record. So part of the Texas Water Plan, there's some recommended water management strategies. This represents the different water strategies over here on the left. From conservation, developing new sources, desalination, and some of the other strategies like ramped up water reuse technology, aquifer storage, and other things. So we look at some of the new sources. We got new reservoirs, handful of new reservoirs. Developing other surface water, pulling water directly out of some of the rivers, and then some groundwater. That would get us about 59% of the projected demand. I also expect to come up with some of the shortfall from water savings of about 2.1 million acre feet a year in just conservation technology, both irrigation, agricultural irrigation, and municipal irrigation. So if we look at our projected supply with new strategies, adopting all these new strategies, we'll have about 9 billion acre feet. Our projected shortfall was 6.6 million acre feet. With all adopting these new strategies will give us an additional 9 million acre feet. So we'll be able to meet those demands. But that comes with a tremendous price tag. Just in the water plan, they're projecting a $53 billion capital outlay. So it's a tremendous price tag that goes along with that. So the question is, where do we come up with that water? Well, these are the different options that we have. The different conservation technology, new resources, desalination, and some of the other strategies. If you look at this total capital cost and break it up by our water use categories, manufacturing, mining, power generation, livestock, irrigation, municipal, by far the municipal uses carry the lion's share of that capital outlay. 86% of that, $45.8 billion, whereas some of the agricultural, livestock, and irrigation account for about 7% of the total capital outlay. So a few take-home points. Rates of rural land conversion have increased significantly over the last 20 years. Our population of Texas is expected to double by 2060, so in the next 50 years, twice as many people living here in the state of Texas as we have now. There's a tremendous demand for land in Texas and corresponding water. One thing we're going to see is a significant competition for those resources. Right now, approximately 85% of Texans live in the metropolitan areas of the state of Texas. Texas is no longer a rural state. With 85% of our population living in cities, they don't realize the benefit of all these rural working lands. So there'll be a huge competition for these resources. History also shows that after major droughts, drought is nothing new in Texas. This is something that's been going on for hundreds, thousands of years. History shows that after major droughts, significant legislative action has been taken to address these water issues. Water is one of the priorities coming up in the next legislative session. There's been significant, several charges coming out of the governor's office, lieutenant governor's office, speaker of the House, charging the legislature to tackle these issues. So we will likely see some sort of significant legislation coming out of Austin addressing water issues. So one of the biggest challenges we have is, as resource managers, natural resource managers, water managers, land managers, is getting folks to realize the link between private lands and what public benefit they get from those rural private lands. One of my favorite quotes, and I think LBJ was, Lyndon B. Johnson was well ahead of the time, but he said, saving the water and the soil must start where the first raindrop falls. And so when we start looking at the public benefit of these rural working lands and the value that they give and provide to the state when it comes to water quality and water quantity, That's where the focus needs to be. And unfortunately, with less than 15% of the state of Texas actually living in on these rural lands, it's sometimes a difficult message to sell. So if we look at what is that public benefit of private lands? How do we, what are they? We can all day long do economic analysis on the impact of the agricultural and forest products industry, livestock industry in the state of Texas. It's easy to put a dollar value on the food resources that they provide, the fiber resources that they provide, but what becomes more difficult is how do we link it to water quality, water quantity? A good land steward, if they're managing their rangeland well, they're managing the forest land well, is going to be contributing positively to water quality. They're going to be contributing positively to water quantity. These rural working lands they're our water catchment. They're the land, they're the sponge. When it rains, like we're getting today, good rangelands soaking it up like a sponge and saving it for another day. When you look at it from the simplest aspect. So the challenge is how do we start developing and getting people to change their mindset and looking at these ecosystem services that these rural working lands provide. Clean air, wildlife habitat, flood mitigation. Something we hadn't had to deal with in Texas lately, but we will one day. We all know the drought will change. Even things something as simple as open space. Realizing the value that farms, ranches, and forests, open space has to national defense. And one of the things we deal with on a regular basis at the Institute is working with the Department of Defense, and they now have unconventional partnership, looking at rural America as being their best neighbor. The national, the Army, the Air Force, Marines, the Navy, they have to train. They have a responsibility to train every year. They have a tremendous training footprint outside their installation, whether it comes in the airspace, noise footprints, dust footprints. Farms, ranches, and forests make great neighbors to the Army. Development, hospitals, schools, subdivisions make it difficult. And I apologize if there's any soccer moms in here, but most soccer moms don't like getting woken up in the middle of the night because they're letting loose the artillery at Fort Hood. But the Army and the Navy and the Air Force, our military has to train as they fight, and they train in all conditions. And so they're starting to realize the link and what value these rural open lands have to them. So, as we start looking at the challenge is looking at how we can, keep these rural lands from losing these rural lands. When I was talking about it earlier, one of the things we need to remember is the primary predictor of land conversion is a loss of the economic profitability of that land. If a landowner can no longer, turn just a simple profit, make enough money off their land to pay their property taxes, they'll start looking at other uses for that land and oftentimes start looking at converting that land. So the real challenge is, we face here in Texas and across the nation is, development of ecosystem markets, where we can start looking at incentive-based programs so that these rural landowners can get paid for producing good wildlife habitat for threatened and endangered species, flood mitigation, open space. It actually incentivizes conservation, and it actually provides additional revenue to for the landowner. Much of the data that we presented to you today is available at texaslandtrends.org. It's a tool that we've developed there in the Institute. It's an interactive tool that we've developed in conjunction with American Farmland Trust that pulls out data from our property tax records here in the state of Texas, and it also looking at the U.S. Ag Census data. And I believe Courtney had this queued up for me perfectly. If you go out to txlandtrends.org, we've got several briefing papers there on the status of some of the different trends in land use throughout the state, broken into some of the different major different regions within the state. And then also a general briefing on some of the ownership trends. Now we've also put together a handful of tools that can allow you to visualize some of that data specific to your portion of the state. I know we've got land managers and folks that represent different parts of the state. we actually go out and look at 10-year trends. You know, if you're interested in a specific county, a specific river basin. Since we're in Waco, we can take a look at the, you know, we'll pick the Brazos River Basin, and it'll go out and pull up all of the information, some of that information that I debuted or showed you there a minute ago. It actually go up and show you the trends in land use, what our acreage totals are for, you know, for example, the acreage totals you have from 1997 to 2007, the change in each of those different land uses, you know, whether it's irrigated cropland, dry cropland, wildlife management, forest, and other. We've got different maps where we can, or charts that can also show those changes in those different ones. And this is a snapshot of the Brazos River Basin. So you can see over the last 10 years, we've seen a 10.3% decrease in the amount of irrigated cropland, significant increase in non-native pasture. See that in map form as well. Looking at changes in, you know, this is looking specifically at irrigated cropland, but we look, say, at native rangeland, where it was at in 1997, where it's at in 2007, if there's any wildlife management. This is actually an interesting map, going back to the wildlife management issue. In 1997, you see very few counties that even, you know, show any amount of wildlife management going on in the county, except for a handful of counties there in the Edwards Plateau. And then in 2007, you start seeing more and more folks adopting that practice, especially there in deep South Texas, there north of the King Ranch. Trends on market value, same sorts of maps there, and ownership size. Something we've added recently, you know, building on this data set, is the ability to compare regions side by side. This is something we rolled out just this last fall. And you can actually compare side by side up to 3 different regions. So you click Region 1. Say we wanted to look at McLennan County within the Brazos River Basin, and we'll compare that to the Edwards Plateau. And what it did is it pulled up, right now we've got the comparison metric is just a general overview. So you can look at McLennan County land use. You've actually seen a 1% increase in the amount of area designated as open space. Overall in the Brazos River Basin, you've seen about a 1% decrease in those lands, the hill country area. And then statewide, comparing it to statewide trends. Market value in McLennan County up 148%. Overall in the Brazos River Basin up 152%. And look at that compared statewide, 139. Let's do the same thing for land use. Looking at similar metrics. And so this gives you a really good tool, you know, for resource planners, decision makers to go out and look at these different trends, you know, side by side for the different areas. So there's a tremendous amount of information out there on the website. I'd encourage any of y'all to go out and take a look. Like I said, we've got some good briefing papers there, just these short PDFs that you can download, kind of take this issue as a snapshot. But it's a tremendous tool there to, you know, really push the message of what the value of these rural working lands are, and then pushing those links to how we can link that to water quality, water quantity, and those other different ecosystem services that they provide. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to answer them now.
On your slide, status and trends in different land use categories, you had all the land uses on there except for irrigated agriculture, irrigated cropland, right? I was just curious if that was what you can tell us about the statewide change in irrigated cropland.
On this one right here? Is this the one you're talking?
I didn't see it there. I was expecting.
We've seen a slight uptick in the amount of irrigated cropland over that 10-year period, but you've seen it where areas like the Brazos River Basin and stuff that 10 years ago, say down in Liberty County, where you saw, or in Brazoria County, where you saw a significant amount of irrigated cropland down there for rice, that has virtually gone away. But you're seeing an increase down in the valley and then in the high plains of additional irrigated cropland. So it's stayed fairly static with only a slight uptick. Yes, ma'am.
Population, you would think that with that's a corresponding demand and opportunity for new agricultural products, a shift in what we grow, whereas we would tend to grow wheat or cotton. There's a demand in the urban areas more for a market for vegetable type things, more of that. Is there a shift in Texas going that way?
I don't know specifically there's a shift in Texas, but I do know, you're seeing more and more land being in the valley being dedicated to those types of crops. Much Texas, it's real seasonal. So the valley is
like an irrigated area.
Mm-hmm.
But I know the farm programs control a lot of those things. But I was just wondering if there's opportunity in that area.
I think there'd definitely be a tremendous demand for those actual products, but there's also a demand for the land where those products are grown. And if you go up the I-35 corridor along the Blackland Prairie, you see those are some very productive agricultural lands that are being, if anybody's gone along Hutto Taylor area, 20 years ago that was all farmland. Now large chunks of it are subdivisions. So. Yeah, I think if you look back 100, 150 years ago where many of the large cities sprung up, they also sprung up along some of the best agricultural land around. And now as we're seeing a build out of those urban areas, what's the first thing to be converted? Some of the really good ag lands. So there's definitely competition for that resource.
Nationwide in those areas that are losing population, there's a trend of taking riparian areas and going back to urban agriculture. Mm-hmm. And then you've got Portland doing some things where they're actually working to build those networks where they have
like the community gardens and
and farm to market type relationships.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, with what was it, 85% of the population living in the state, there's still going to be a huge number of people that have no idea how to garden. And they're going to depend on those farmers and ranchers to produce their land. So there's many challenges that we'll be facing when it comes to that. Yes, sir.
Todd, actually on the same slide, you have that category wildlife management. How broadly is that defined? Does it include sort of set aside land for recreation or open space?
Now this is just land that's set aside. This is remember, all this data comes from the property tax records. So the data is actually coming from the folks who are paying property taxes. And what wildlife management is, it's another 1D1 open space classification that allows them to get to adopt a management plan that states that their primary use of the land is from a wildlife management standpoint, and they get the same lower tax value that the agricultural or forest products in it, folks would get. So, as far as land that's specifically set aside for open space, or public lands, things like that aren't on the tax rolls, this doesn't capture that. But, one thing you got to remember, Texas, 95% or greater than 95% of the state of Texas is privately owned. With Texas is it's not like many of the western states where 90% of the state is owned by the government. Texas is a private land state. So when we start looking at initiatives to push for conservation, better natural resource management, better water management, water resource management, it's got to be driven by, what can we do on private lands? Yes, sir.
Are you familiar with what percentage or fraction of those lands are held by absentee owners?
Not off the top of my head, but it's going to vary by state. I know in parts of East Texas.
Northern states, Indiana, Illinois, some of those are as high as 75%, but I wasn't sure what Texas might be at.
Yeah, I've seen those numbers, and they're eluding me now. But I know in some parts of the state it's very high. The absentee land ownership rates are extremely high, and I would I would bet especially in East Texas, it's very high rates of absentee.
Does that factor into how you try to manage when you have absentee ownership?
Absolutely. There's so many different socio-demographic factors that go into landowners' attitudes towards land management and conservation. Earlier I was saying, the average landowner in the state of Texas is over 58 years old. So in the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see this huge shift in land ownership in the state of Texas. With that shift in ownership change, you're also going to see a huge change in people's attitudes toward land management. People who've never lived or worked on the land, they've just inherited the land. There's a really good thesis that a young lady at Texas A&M did probably 7 or 8 years ago, named Jenny Kearley Sanders. She used to work for Texas Wildlife Association. But she looked at that specifically in the Hill Country, looking at landowner attitudes, what their background was, if they were born to the land, someone who lived and worked on land all their life. She also looked at a class of landowners that she classified them as reborn to the land. They're folks like my dad. Grew up on a farm in northeast Texas, went to college, moved away, retired, has bought land, and is now working it, but he hadn't been in that industry for 30, 35 years, but reborn to the land. So they bring a different land ethic. They bring a different management. So there's different classes of landowners, and so it's going to become a diverse, wider group of landowners that we're dealing with. So that's another one of those challenges. How you reach out to these different groups. How you tap in to what they want to do. One of the big debates is that we go through is we've got all kinds of conservation tools in the toolbox to promote conservation. The big challenge is not every one of those tools works for every landowner. And so we got to align them with the right tool that not only pushes the ball forward for conservation, but it also meets their needs.
Are any of those absentee ownership statistics on those websites?
No, they're not, but I think that's a good, that'd be a good thing to incorporate in there.
Speaking of landowner attitudes, I think it's interesting that your data will prove up why it's difficult to get some landowners, to get excited about implementing best management practices on their properties, because as you saw, particularly the smaller acreage landowners are already in a minimal to no profit situation.
Right.
And when they're asked to find money out of their own pockets to implement BMPs, they automatically become defensive and to the idea of how can we help improve water quality. So
right.
That's the real key of how to get these people involved.
Right. How to engage the smaller landowners, and anybody who's ever worked in the industry, it all goes back to the economies of scale. It's much more expensive to do a prescribed fire on a 100-acre tract of land than it is a 10,000-acre tract of land. The management costs are much higher. So there's so many challenges that we're going to be dealing with, and they all deal with these pressures that we're putting on our rural working lands. Sorry.
With the changing population and changing attitudes in Texas and becoming an urban state, really, urban population state, has anyone in the legislature been interested in this type of data and looked at different ways to preserve ag lands and maybe give more home rule to counties for land use planning and that?
As far as when you say land use planning at the county level, I haven't seen a big push for that. Now there may be at the individual county, but I haven't seen a push for that from the legislature. I know there's the general attitude in Texas that this is a private land state, private property right state, and so some of what you're talking about there'd be some significant pushback. I think some of the folks we're working with, you're seeing more and more people interested in this type of information. They see the issue coming, and it's our job to help give them the best information they can to help them make those decisions, and maybe start building some of these systems that we're talking about that incentivize good land stewardship. Give landowners incentive not to convert their land to something else other than convert it to a subdivision. If we can, help them maintain economic profitability on their land, that's going to be a deterrent to land use conversion. There's also the regulatory land use planning standpoint, but I think, if we're pushing the ball forward on conservation, the biggest thing is to help the landowner, stay on the land.
So earlier in your presentation, you had a slide on loss of irrigated lands.
Mm-hmm.
There was a map, state map, and it looked like it was correlated to metropolitan areas, with the exception of, at least as far as I know, far west Texas. And I was curious to know if that had to do with, sprawl of the El Paso area, or have they just run out of water in West Texas?
When you say irrigated lands?
Yeah. I believe it was. It was, I don't know, number 10 or so in your presentation.
Well, this is looking at irrigated cropland. What we have up there, this is coming right off the website. And if you look at irrigated cropland, where the vast majority of the irrigated cropland is in the state is, in the valley, there just south of Corpus Christi, and then in the high plains where you see a lot of center pivot irrigation. There's still a significant amount of irrigated cropland there around El Paso. We can look at them side by side here.
Yeah. Can you go back to the presentation? It was pretty specific. It lined up pretty well with Houston, Dallas. That one right there on the left-hand side.
Right. But this isn't just irrigated land. This is the concentrated areas where we're losing agricultural lands. So this is...
So the question still would be, is that area growing? Is the El Paso area, is the loss of the land due to population growth and growing?
Oh, the stuff there around El Paso? Okay, yeah, that's actually, there's an anomaly in the data set. There's two things going on there. Right there around El Paso, we're seeing significant growth. Urban sprawl, just like you're seeing around Houston, Dallas, Austin, San Antonio area. But also out there in one of those counties, over the last 10 years, there was and it was actually funny, when we found the data, we actually called the local appraisal district trying to figure out what was going on, because you're seeing this loss of land going off the roll as agricultural open space. There was actually a large land ownership, huge land ownership out there. It was subdivided for subdivisions and taken off the rolls by some developer in New York, and they were selling the land on eBay to people who wanted their piece of Texas. But there was no legal easement to these pieces of property. There was no, it was a huge land scam. So there, in that little portion there, just east of El Paso, there's an anomaly in the data that, in all it is someone was pulling a fast one on people who had no idea what they were buying.
That 1.4 million acres, just give me an idea of how many counties are, would that be equivalent to, one of the larger counties in West Texas? How big is 1.4 acres, 1.4 million acres on that?
Try to get a good example.
I'm trying to get my head around how much more that is.
It's a big area. I don't have a good example of how big that would be. But let's see. I guess McLennan County. We're in McLennan County right now, so let's see how big McLennan County is. So this is all we're reporting on here is in McLennan County it's 600,000 acres of so it would probably be a 2 or 3 county area, the equivalent of a 2 or 3 county area, another 1.4 million acres converted.
Depends on which counties you're talking
Right. Yeah. Okay. Not some of the larger like Brewster County.
Okay.
That's what I was trying to get. Yeah, but your average county here in Central Texas.
Okay.
But that's a good example. I have to remember that one as the equivalent of losing Harris County or something.
Any other questions for Todd?
Is this presentation available somewhere?
Yes, we can make that available. And all the data is also all the underlying data is available there at texaslandtrends.org.
We sure appreciate it,
All
Todd.
right, thank you all.
Some of the key things that I saw, especially the first time I looked at it, is number one, I think it's really good to take a step back. I know I get focused on whatever watersheds I'm working on, but it's good to take a step back and look at the issues that are facing Texas in general. I know you guys that work in the Houston area and the Metroplex, the population growth is something y'all deal with every day, but in many parts of the state, we may not necessarily think about that, but it's a tremendous issue, something we all need to be aware of, potentially concerned with, and prepared to deal with. And then secondly, just some of the tools. I think this is a very valuable tool, like I said, as you are working in your watershed, just to get an idea of kind of the private property issues and what the landowners are dealing with there, profitability and things like that. That's something we need to keep in mind as we go try to encourage B&P adoption. Like Commissioner Clary stated, with smaller ownerships, getting B&P implementation, they're already losing money, and then you're expecting them to pay another, so many thousand acres to implement, or not $1,000 or so to implement some B&Ps. They're having to come out of grocery money for them to do that. So, when we struggle to get B&Ps implemented, that definitely needs to be a consideration there. We're going to take about a 20-minute break here, and then when we come back, we're going to try out, gotomeeting.com for the first time, and hear about using watershed report cards to inform stakeholders. Thank you.